Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by River, the place that I personally go to securely invest in Bitcoin with confidence and with zero fees.
When I was interviewing Elon for the Founders book, and we were talking about what is money. He said, money is just an information system, right? It's a way for us to avoid having to barter. That's almost an exact quote from something he said to me. And he says, because it's an information system, you can see how a universe of digital currencies is actually a much more efficient information system by Shannon terms than something like handing you, Preston, a dollar, right? Because it's just like there's a lot of friction involved there.
I'm thrilled to have this conversation. I read your book years ago, but I know this is going to be a fun chat to have because I'm such a fan of your book and I'm a fan of Claude Shannon, and this should be a really fun one.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, Shannon's having a moment, and like he keeps having these little moments. So I'm excited to dive in. It'll be a lot of fun.
I had a person ask me recently, like a family friend, and they were like, who do you think is like one of the most inspirational or impactful people of like the last 100 years? And so we were like, oh, I don't know. And I said, well, a person that's really impressed me that I think doesn't get a lot of credit is Claude Shannon because of his information theory and like what it's really led to in being able to just communicate. So starting off, I'm curious why you decided to write an entire book, an amazing book, like the resources in this. Man, you did your homework. I can't even imagine how long this took. What fascinated you to the point where like, I'm going to write a book about this guy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really appreciate the kind words. This was one of those projects, like, I am not an electrical engineer. I am not a mathematician. And so I was in sort of foreign territory here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I was trying to figure this out and make sense of it for myself so that I could make sense of it for other people.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had the same instinct that this was this hugely interesting, complex, important person, and like nobody had written a biography of him that made any sense. But I'll rewind the clock a bit to tell you how it came about. A friend of mine sent me a copy of a book called The Idea Factory by this author, John Gertner. And The Idea Factory is a really close look at Bell Laboratories. So for your listeners, like they might know the name Bell Labs. They probably know the name Alexander Graham Bell, and they know that Bell invented the telephone. Fast forward a few decades, like several decades, 6, 7 decades, and the Bell Systems Telephone Company is this massive enterprise. I mean, it is basically, I think, like the second largest employer in the country outside of the Defense Department at one point, because they run the phone system. Right? It's like, and the phone system at that time is everything. Within the Bell system, they create this organization, sort of like what Google did with its Moonshot Factory, where they created Bell Laboratories. So the idea was like, we have this labs arm, right? They do all this like kind of interesting research to advance the company. And The Idea Factory is a book about Bell Labs. And the reason there should be a book about Bell Labs, frankly, more books about Bell Labs, is because Bell Labs was arguably like one of the highest concentrations of just pure innovation ever in history through all time. They win 6 Nobel Prizes. They invent the transistor. They invent touch-tone dialing. They make improvements on the bazooka. They invent communication networks. Like they invent satellites. So it's basically the entire modern underpinning of the underpinning of modern life. In that book, there's one section, a tiny section, about this guy who worked there, whose name is Dr. Claude Shannon. And then they talk about this guy who's like unicycling in the hallways. He's playing chess in the cafeteria. He's kind of weird. He like sort of a loner, but like with really smart people, he becomes really good friends. And in 1948, while working at Bell Labs, he publishes this paper in the Bell Systems Technical Journal. And that paper really is one of the reasons why modern digital life exists the way it does. And he didn't collaborate with anybody on it. It was sort of done in like I call it the ultimate side hustle, because he like did it on the off hours, nights, weekends, etc. And this paper, well, one person described it sort of came like a bomb, right? Because all of a sudden you have this new field, information theory, that's invented basically out of whole cloth. And he does it. And he's super interesting. He like invents the world's first chess playing computer. All of these things. I'm reading in this book, The Idea Factory. So I go on Amazon. This is market research for authors. And I'm like, all right, let me buy a book about this guy. And I type in his name and I can't find anything. And my friend had actually suggested, the friend who sent me the book said, hey, you should really look at this Claude Shannon guy. He might be a good subject for you to write about. And I realized, I was like, you know, there's just like a space on the bookshelf where his story should be. And he's more than just some scientist. He's like a wildly interesting person in the way he lived his life. And so I was like, so those are the key ingredients for a biography. One, it's a person interesting to read about, because otherwise it's just like, you know, watching paint dry or doing your homework or something. And the other is, did they do something important? And I kind of had both of them in this subject. And I also got the sense that, like, you know, Richard Feynman became famous and became a personality. Albert Einstein became famous, became a personality. This is someone with the same IQ points, the same contribution scientifically, at the same level, we should say. But Claude Shannon actively avoided becoming famous. And so it made his story in some ways more interesting, but it was the reason that no one had done a biography. And so that's the kind of story that led me to writing the book. I was just like, I mean, really, if you boil it down, I went on Amazon to try to buy it and I couldn't find it, so I decided to do it. And obviously there's a lot of steps from there, but I found him curious and inventive and interesting and super important. And it was kind of like, somebody should do this. Like, and then I just sort of dubbed myself as somebody.
Well, no, to your point, I know, I forget how I became interested in him. And that was exactly what I did. I immediately went to Amazon and was like, all right, I'm going to deep dive on him. This is, like I said, a couple years ago. And your book is really kind of one of the only books out there. And obviously it had great reviews. And then I read it and it was amazing. And maybe that's why you're not going to have any competition, is because you covered it so well. But you're right. I mean, there's not many people that have written about him.
That's right. And I would add two disclaimers for your audience, because, you know, it's sort of important to get some of this stuff. Like, people are listening and they're like, why should we keep listening to this? Right. The other thing that Claude Shannon has is an incredible IRR as an investor. People don't know this, but he's actually like a very gifted investor and got super obsessed with the stock market, wrote a bunch of papers and ideas and concepts in this space. He was friends with Henry Singleton, who Warren Buffett admires. Warren Buffett, I think, once called Singleton like the single best capital allocator in history. Shannon served on the board of Teledyne, the Teledyne Corporation. And there were all of these things in the investment world too that Shannon did that, again, nobody knew about. And like, I only discovered them later in my research. I would say the other interesting thing about Shannon's life is, you know, he wasn't a tortured genius, right? Does that make sense? Like we have this vision of like, if you're going to do something great in the world, then you need to have like deep scars, you know, and like you need to hate yourself. And there were definitely times in Shannon's life that were hard. But on the whole, one of the remarkable things about Shannon's life is he's basically like a playful genius throughout his life, right? Yeah. And it's why I call the book A Mind to Play. And it's what people can take from him that's bigger than just like, hey, there's this scientist. It's really, if you read the book, I think the way that I intended it is, what does play have to do with serious work? Like science or like investing or like building machines or anything else? Why is playfulness important? That's one kind of through line in the book. And then the last thing I would say is, like, for anybody listening who is like, hey, this sounds super interesting, but I have a lot going on and I don't want to read a book. There's a really good documentary called The Bit Player that you should be able to Google and find. And it's the only documentary about Claude Shannon. And to your point, this is what I'm circling back to your point, which is, I thought Shannon mattered. And what I didn't know is that there are actually a lot of people who agree with me. And so the book has become kind of a cult hit among, particularly, I would say, investment professionals, but many others, because they actually want to know more about him. Yeah. And I didn't know that going in. Ironically, it's like the thing Shannon would have liked least is like being sort of pseudo famous now, right? And so it's like he passed away many years ago, but like he actually particularly avoided this kind of fame and interest and whatever, because he just wanted to do his own things all the time throughout his life.
You talk about this in the book a little bit. You talk about how after he published his information theory, how he would not respond to letters and communications and was really kind of detached from any type of comms. And the irony of this is that he created, or he mathematically figured out how to conduct communications, but then in his own life, in the own way he was conducting them, he wasn't communicating. And then to a second point in your book, if I remember this correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember there being something in there about how his parents were like investors and making him read maybe like the Wall Street Journal or something when he was a really young kid. So he kind of came very wired for understanding investing at a young age. Am I remembering that correctly, or?
Yeah, so I'll do the first one first, and then the second on the. Actually, let me tackle the investment because that one's easy. Yeah. No, actually, he was the parent who.
Okay.
Who like what happened? Here's what happened. So in their later ages, like when I think they were around 50 or 60, Shannon leaves Bell Laboratories for MIT, and the family settles in a town called Winchester, Massachusetts. It's one of these bedroom communities outside of MIT, and they start to get interested in the stock market. So this is like in the 70s and 80s. So they buy a stock ticker, they start reading the quotes, they start buying copies of the Wall Street Journal. And I interviewed Peggy Shannon and Andrew Shannon. Peggy and Andrew were son and daughter of Claude and Betty Shannon. And they told me about how like we grew up with a lot of weird stuff happening around the house because our dad was Claude Shannon. And I said, well, give me some examples. And they were like, well, you know, not everybody's dad like juggles. Yeah. Not everybody's dad has like a 2-story workshop that's filled with like toys and robots and chess playing computers and stuff. And they said, and the other thing is our parents were very seriously interested in the stock market. And they would take, like we had the Wall Street Journal at the table. We were always talking about it. You know, they had people over. They were talking about investments. So it was sort of in the air in that way. And that was interesting. You know, I don't know that it shaped those kids profoundly in any way. I mean, maybe it did. It wasn't anything I got into because I was actually writing the story of Claude Shannon. But I found it interesting that like all these things became a part of their family life too, right? It wasn't like work was separated from life. There was this, just to give a story on that, there's this great moment where they're hosting some dinner party or something, and Peggy Shannon is carrying toothpicks, like a box of toothpicks from one place to another. I think it was toothpicks or pins or something. And she's walking, something happens, the box of toothpicks drops on the ground. And she looks up, her dad's there. She thought her dad was going to get mad or something. You know, like a parent might get upset that you've like made this mess. And her dad looks at it and says something along the lines of, it's been a while since I looked at this, but her dad basically looks at it and says, did you know there's like a mathematical equation that can predict the pattern that would be created by you dropping those things on the ground, right? Another story in this vein, when they would decide how to do dishes, instead of just assigning the roles to people like, hey, Andrew, it's your night to wash, or hey, Claude, it's your night to wash, they had a multi-sided die, like a 16-sided die or something, and they would roll this dice, and every person had a series of numbers. And like that was the game of chance that they would play to see who had to do the dishes that night, right? So there were things like that that were in the ether in their home. It wasn't the case that he was the parent. You asked him, your first question was about fame and like his relationship with both fame and acclaim, like just like being acclaimed for this information theory. Here's what happened. It's actually kind of a great story. This paper is published in 1948 in 2 parts. And almost right away, like his world of electrical engineering and mathematics and communication technology notices. And everybody's like, oh, this is a big deal. Like, you know, like Claude Shannon has done something significant here. So he's put on all these lists of like the most promising scientists. He's given a profile in Vogue magazine. This famous photographer comes and shoots photos of him. And he has this moment where he's like a scientific celebrity for like a hot second. He doesn't enjoy it. He actually, what he wants to be doing is he wants to be at his workshop tinkering. He wants to be building machines. He wants to be thinking. He wants to be writing. And he kind of just like turns out like he just doesn't embrace the fame that's coming to him. So he'll like you said this, but I'll sort of go a little further in the explanation. People would send him letters, and he had literally a folder that was like letters I've waited too long to respond to, right? And he would just like stuck it in there. He wouldn't give talks. He didn't say yes to invitations that he got to give talks unless his wife wanted to travel to the location that they were going to go. So like he gets invited to give like, you know, prestigious talks around the world. And it's only on the urging of his wife, Betty, that he's like, all right, fine, I'll like go give the talk so we can travel to Japan, right? And so there's this really, but he wanted to keep to himself and do his own work. the other thing that happens that is in some ways more interesting, and I think it's more relevant for an age of like TikTok and Twitter and meme stocks and everything, all of these people look at information theory and they're like, oh man, I could use information theory to explain everything. I could use it to explain bird song. I could use it to explain this, that, and the other. So you have all these people jumping on the bandwagon. And Claude Shannon actually publishes this very short piece. I think it was like 350 words called The Bandwagon. And it's to his people in his field. It's to other electrical engineers. And what he basically says, I'm paraphrasing, is he says, listen, I know there's a lot of enthusiasm about information theory, but we have a lot of research left to do to take the work I've done and turn it into practical technologies for people, and to write new proofs and to design new technologies and everything else. So basically, like, it's effective. Like, it's like everybody slow your roll. Like, this is cool. It's not the theory of everything, right?
Yeah.
And he actually does what so many people don't do. Like, if you have a successful paper or a successful book or a successful anything in modern life, you know, most people just like ramp that up. They had 25 versions of that, right? Like, it's like, oh, Fast and the Furious is successful, we should make 12 of them. Right? You know, it's like let's do that. You know, everybody get on the bandwagon. And so you have this temptation, and he rejects it wholesale. He says, no, this is like information theory. It needs to be further developed. There needs to be more research, more work. I understand that work is valuable, but let's like keep, he says, let's keep our house in order, is what he says. Right.
Yeah.
And to me, it was like, it was super counterintuitive. It's not what you would want to, like, it's not what a lot of modern people would do, right? You have one viral song hit about finance bros, and now you're like signing a deal in Columbia, and Shannon has this viral scientific hit. And instead of doing what everyone else might have done, he leaves Bell Labs, goes to MIT, builds a workshop, and starts the next phase of his life, which is like this interesting tinkering, game playing machine part of his life.
Wow. It's funny you made the comment about everybody just basically saying information theory is this or that and everything else. I found it really interesting, and I know this is a huge tangent. David Sinclair, I don't know if you're familiar with his work at Harvard and his information theory of aging.
That's right.
Which is talking about how the epigenetics in your cells are losing data and losing information, and then they can't communicate in order to keep you healthy, is a huge pull on some of these ideas that Shannon has put forth.
And I would say, by the way, he takes it very seriously. Dr. Sinclair and I, we've actually corresponded about Shannon. He's a huge Shannon fan. And I wrote him when his book came out because he had mentioned Shannon a couple of us. I said, hey, you know, you went, and he had already read A Mind at Play, and we created some really nice notes. Now, what's interesting is, you know, he is carefully and rigorously applying the principles that are in information theory to discuss his field. And so there is this really like I think what Shannon was saying was like, let's electrical engineers not try to puff this up too much in our domain, but the metaphor or some of the principles that are in information theory apply very well in other domains. I'll give you another example that's probably more relevant to your audience and actually has some crossover with some of the other work I've done. You know, one of the things that people have mentioned is that there's a fair amount of overlap in the world of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and the work of information theory.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is because what systems do is reduce noise in financial transactions, right? They reduce latency. And well, noise is not latency, but they reduce latency. And for a separate project, when I was interviewing Elon for the Founders book, which is about PayPal, and we were talking about the role of money, like what is money? He sort of has this view. He said, money is just an information system, right? It's a way for us to avoid having to barter. That's almost an exact quote from something he said to me. It's like a way that we don't have to barter. Like it's an information system. And he says, because it's an information system, you can see how a universe of digital currencies is actually a much more efficient information system by Shannon terms than something like handing you, Preston, $1, right? Because it's just like there's a lot of friction involved there. And so there are some interesting applications of information theory around the world. Like it's actually, and useful ones. In the case of Sinclair, information being encoded into our genes, right? Shannon actually did work on genetics before he published the information theory paper. And so there are some useful applications. I think what was happening is that people were not treating the work with sufficient seriousness in 1949 and 1950 and 1951. And a lot of those people were within Shannon's field And that's why he had to kind of throw the brushback pitch of that bandwagon paper.
Wow. That is fascinating. I'm so impressed that you coordinated with David on the work he was doing there too. That's so cool. And if people are curious about that, oh my gosh, go read his book. What's the Lifespan is the name of the book.
He's got another one as well.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And he does such a great job kind of making it accessible for people that maybe aren't into biology. Okay, I would love for you to explain information theory for people that have no idea what it is. Like if you were going to really kind of break it down into like the basics, explain what it is and why it's so groundbreaking and why it's actually this underpinning for all communications we see today.
Yeah, and you know, this is one of those where I'm going to do my best. And I translated it and spent a lot of time thinking about that chapter of the book when we were writing it, right? And so there's a little bit of like, if you feel like my explanation is inadequate, like find me on Twitter, shoot me a DM or shoot me an email, and I'll just send you that chapter of the book because it'll do a much better job than I can in 30 seconds of explaining it. But here's the visual that I would use that helps best explain what information theory actually does and why it matters. Right now, you and I are able to communicate over Zoom, or I can like pick up my phone and download a YouTube video, right? And watch a YouTube video. And the reason that that process can happen is because of the transmission of information, but it's compressed information, right? And what information theory does is it provides a model for the compression and transmission of information without loss of meaning, right? So I'll give you a kind of example that emerges in the paper, right? Which is there are a bunch of different ways to convey a piece of information without losing meaning. You can shout louder, right? You can repeat yourself. You can do many things to communicate information better. But some of those ways of communicating information better will just add to the amount of time or the amount of bits that you need to communicate information. So the real trick in information theory is, how do I tell Preston a sentence in this video? And how is it communicated as efficiently as possible? And one of the things, and there's a number of components to this, but one of the things that Shannon explains to people in information theory is there's a lot of redundancy in the English language, right? So he'll take a sentence, like the fox jumped over the something, and he'll show how even if you eliminated most of the vowels or a few other letters within that sentence, someone reading it could actually still make sense of it. And that compression is one of the ways that you and I can have this exchange without it taking like 7 years, right? And so that's like, the reason I'm doing that is because I want to connect the theory to the technology, which is, this is effectively the theoretical plumbing for all of modern life. It affects everything from the phone calls we make to like this exchange to like a video or a song. If you're using Spotify, you are, in some meaningful way using Claude Shannon's information theory, right? And the idea is, how do you most efficiently and in the most compressed format possible communicate information with high fidelity? How do you make sure? And what Shannon outlines is he outlines a theoretical limit for some of these, for this, like it's called the Shannon limit. And since he laid down that limit, engineers have basically been trying to get us technologies that communicate up to that limit. And that's why it was such an earthquake. Someone finally figured out that there was a model for this. And he lays it out in a little drawing. And if any of your listeners are curious, they can just Google like information theory and they'll see a little drawing. And he basically outlines that there's a sender, there's noise, there's a channel, and there's a recipient. And he shows you different ways to reduce noise in that channel, right? And so that's what we're trying. That's like the basic guts of information theory, is how do we communicate? Now, a number of surprising things emerge from this. One of the surprising things that emerges is Shannon posits that like the actual value of information is not the meaning, it's the surprise, right? So that's like a really interesting thing. So like, here's an example. Like
what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So what he's saying is it's that all information can basically be abstracted into a mathematical formula. That there's no difference between me saying the fox jumps over the dog. Mathematically, there's no difference between me saying the fox jumps over the dog and the dog jumps over the fox. They're actually identical. So meaning doesn't matter. like the actual bits, mathematically, they're equivalent, right? He also points out that because the English language has so much redundancy in it, it's surprise that is the thing you're trying to control for. Like if you have a word that's unexpected after another word, that's new, quote unquote, new information, right? So a good example of this, the letter U always follows the letter Q. So if you see a letter Q, I think it's like a 99.9999% chance that the next letter after Q is U. But if all of a sudden, let's say next year, Merriam-Webster, there's some word that goes viral, right? And it's Q and it doesn't have a U after it, that is actually, from an information theory perspective, that is more information, meaning this new word is surprising and ergo is new information because we have to do more to convey it. We have to do more to communicate it. Now I'm getting a little abstract, but I think people can get the idea, which is the basic idea is there's a ton of redundancy within the English language, and you can eliminate whole words and whole vowels and people can still understand something, right? And so you can use that redundancy to your advantage because what you can do, and this is where Shannon applies the information theory, you can encode messages with certain kinds of redundancy so that my message to you is conveyed in a, not perfectly, but almost perfectly, right? And by the way, this is like I don't know if people ever watched the show Silicon Valley, but when they're talking about like lossless compression algorithms, the lossless compression algorithm idea traces directly back to this paper. And so for people who are working in modern communications, you stand in a 70-year legacy of something that started with Claude Shannon, which is how do I get a text on my phone to be transmitted from planet Earth to a satellite and over to Preston without losing any of the meaning. And that is the theoretical work that Claude Shannon did.
This is mind-blowing stuff. So, so something that I've heard recently is with like ChatGPT-4, and because this is when we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about compression, right? We're talking about the compression of patterns. One of the things that I read is they took and I might be getting this way off, but generically speaking, I think this is accurately described. When you take a WAV file and you compress it into an MP3, it has way smaller amounts of data that's being stored and also to send. I heard that they could take a WAV file and they could run it through one of these AI models and it would give you better compression than the MP3 compression, meaning it's being stored and with the same level of quality as an MP3, but with less data required to store it. This all relates back to Shannon's, right? This is all like interconnected with the math and the theory that he came up with. And correct me if I'm probably saying this way wrong, but with more entropy, and I think this is what you were getting at there, is with more entropy, you allow for more data to be transmitted. Is that effectively, is that being stated correctly?
Yeah, and people are going to have to forgive me because it's been a number of years since I wrote this work and since the book's been out. And I think we have to be careful because data and entropy are really specific terms within this field. So I want to be careful about not sort of going over my skis or getting things wrong.
I'm way over mine. I'm way over
no, it's all right. But the basics of what you said are correct, which is like the more that like let me point two things. One is these compression algorithms have gotten better over time. And it doesn't surprise me that large language models, which are studying like language broadly defined, right? That they have found ways to compress files further and make the amount of data that is transmitted smaller, right? Because what they're probably doing is they probably have better ways of predicting what the next word or what the next bit or what the next thing will be, right? And when you can get that prediction improved, you don't need as much data transmitted, right? And so it's almost like one of these, like if you didn't need a specific word or bit and you cut it out, you've taken, let's say 10 units of data and you've made it into 8 units of data. And there was a time when we needed to convey every single bit. And now because of these predictive technologies, we can communicate with fewer bits, right? And by the way, we're at the 10,000 foot level on this, and we're also at the limits of my understanding about how LLMs actually do this. But
Yeah.
these things are intimately tied together, because the whole thing, the whole sort of genius insight for Shannon was, we actually don't need most of the English language. Like, and that applies across different fields. We actually don't need this, and this in order to communicate a message. And it allows for more efficient communication. So it doesn't surprise me that the world of like AI and LLMs has embraced this to make compression better. And I actually suspect that this is going to herald an era in which technologies like 6G are come to market more, much more quickly. Like, I think there's
Yeah.
going to be
Yeah.
a bunch of changes because of this. Because honestly, like, it's part of the magic of playing around with some of these tools is seeing exactly how they know what to do, because they are predicting things that used to be done by us, even on image creation, right?
Yeah.
So on image creation, they can predict that this shade of blue should be, based on statistical probabilities, probabilistically speaking, this shade of blue should be next to this shade of blue on a picture of planet Earth, right? That's a probabilistic determination. They're making a best guess at what something could be. But it turns out the machines are pretty good at guessing. They've gotten better.
Yeah. I might go way over my ski tips here on this next one, but I want to ask it anyway. So I'm curious if Shannon wrote about the increase in demand for energy for basically unwrapping the messages on the receive side because they're so deeply compressed. So when we get into compression, like we could compress a message down to, I mean, as an example, we could take one of these LLMs that are 600 gigabyte files. That's all the bigger that some of them are. And I mean, they're insanely powerful. They can answer almost any question, and they're only about, half a tera. We could compress that using SHA-256 encryption down to 64 characters, like all 600 gigabytes down to 64 characters, and transmit it, very simply. But on the other side of that, to understand what was in that half a tera file, it would take 3.6 times 10 to the 49th years to decompress that file that is only 64 characters by taking a half a tera. So there's energy required on the receive side of a message that's been deeply compressed in order to. And so you're putting the onus on the receiver. So I'm sending you this message right now as we're talking. You're receiving it. You're computing it inside your head. But if I was going to simplify and compress all of that message into 2 words and send it to you, you now have to do a whole bunch of work on your end in order to decompress those 2 words, assuming I could compress it into 2 words. Just getting dramatic here with the example. So I'm curious, did you study anything that Shannon ever talked about that? Because I think this is, and the reason I asked this question, I think in the coming 10 years, 15 years, the energy demands that we're going to have in order to deal with all of this compression, especially AI compression, is going to be off the charts. And I don't think the world's prepared for it. I think it's about to get crazy.
It's a great question. And in some ways, it's a very simple answer, which is Shannon was in the following great position or privileged position. He published information theory, not the application of information theory. And so he had this great, there's a bunch of great lines about this from other people in the field. And they basically said, they were like, Shannon didn't identify what the error correcting codes were going to be or what the algorithms were actually going to be that did this. All he did, his genius insight, was identifying that this was a statistical possibility, that it was actually possible for engineers to do this. And what that did is it was like a starter gun. It basically sent the rest of that domain off on a search to find the codes that would most efficiently compress information, that would reach the Shannon limit, that would enable the technologies of today. Shannon didn't do that. He had a hugely groundbreaking insight in that this is possible. We can statistically do this. But he laid out the theoretical architecture for it. A good analogy or a good way to think about it is, when Galileo was basically challenging the church and saying, no, the earth revolves around the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. This is heliocentrism versus geocentrism. Galileo didn't have to do everything that came after the acceptance of geocentrism, meaning like there's a bunch of stuff that we've discovered about the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun after Galileo, right? He wasn't doing all of that, but it was important that the theory of geocentrism be broadly accepted as the truth so that we could do all of these other things, right? In the same way, once Shannon identified that it was possible to do this, it sent the rest of his field off on the research that for the next 60, 70, and still going on today, would create the algorithms that we use to transmit information. So the short answer is not really, and he wasn't really thinking in practical terms about what energy demands would be required, because remember at the time that he's doing this writing, 1948, computers are still like these room-sized things. Yeah. You know, they like computers are mechanical devices; they're not digital devices yet. The digital world is still super far off, and so he eventually like he becomes an enthusiast. He obviously builds some of these things. He gets he gets an Apple II that was delivered from Steve Jobs. He embraces all of that, but the technologies are very primitive in 1948. So it's a conversation that's a little bit, it's years away, right? But it is why with the subtitle and with the way that the book kind of was embraced, it's like we really do live in Shannon's world. Like this is like everything that is going on today is Shannon's world. And I agree with you, by the way, that I think the information demands based on these technologies are going to be significant. Ironically, I also think there's a world in which these technologies help us figure out that problem, right?
Yeah, true.
So, like there's a lot of promising stuff happening in this world, and I'm not at all an expert in that. But my sense is that ambitious, smart people are trying to figure that out and are doing they're giving it a college try that seems pretty serious.
Well, to your point, you mentioned 6G earlier, that's exactly what you have. And so like when we're looking at the electromagnetic spectrum and all of this demand of people wanting to zap communications through the air, the bandwidth is it's limited. There's only so much bandwidth that you can shoot these messages through. But with AI and compression, now we can take the code that we're communicating in, run it through AI, and figure out ways to compress it even further, which then allows more space to shoot these messages through the electromagnetic spectrum. So, perfect example of what you're saying. One of the most common questions I get asked from family and friends is, Preston, where do you personally buy your Bitcoin from? And the answer is really simple. I buy it on river.com. Not only can you easily buy Bitcoin with zero fees on recurring orders, you can have peace of mind knowing Bitcoin on River is held one-to-one in multi-sig cold storage, all while being fully licensed and regulated in the United States. Plus, their relationship managers are US-based and available by phone for you or your business. Additionally, River has built their own infrastructure from the ground up, which means they don't rely on third parties to function like other Bitcoin exchanges. River also just created a new feature not found anywhere else called River Link. It allows you to send Bitcoin over a text message to easily orange pill your family, pay a friend for dinner, or send a gift. There's a new standard for investing in Bitcoin, and River is setting it. Go to river.com/fundamentals and get up to $100 free when you sign up and buy Bitcoin. That's river.com/fundamentals. In a world where convenience often compromises security, many investors settle for solutions that do not fully meet the demands of Bitcoin security. That's where the Bitcoin Way comes in. Offering a personalized white glove service, they will guide you through every step of the way to achieve full self-custody, ensuring you adhere to the strictest self-custody standards. Their experienced team helps establish robust security practices that cover all aspects of self-custody, cybersecurity, and privacy. Their ultimate goal? To empower you to become fully sovereign. Beyond securing your Bitcoin, they also offer services such as inheritance planning, Plan B strategies, assisting in relocating to Bitcoin-friendly locations to further enhance your sovereignty, and much, much more. Take the first step to true financial independence. Visit thebitcoinway.com/TIP to schedule your free consultation call. Don't delay in securing your generational wealth the right way. Opt in for security over convenience and protect your future. Your family line will thank you.
And you use the word code, as did I, because there are codes. There are error correcting codes that are used to communicate digital messages. It's an interesting word, though. And the reason it's interesting is because the other cool part of Shannon's life is what happens right before the information theory paper. he is a code breaker during World War II. And so part of what he's studying, like here's an example. There was a phone system that was used to, that Churchill used to communicate with FDR. It's called Sig Sally. Sig Sally was designed and developed at Bell Laboratories. It was I think it was a pretty top secret project. A lot of information's emerged about it after the fact. But Shannon was one of the engineers working on these code breaking devices. He was also somebody who, like, that was an important job during the war, was figuring out how can President Franklin Delano Roosevelt send a message to Winston Churchill that cannot be intercepted by the Nazis, right? And so part of what Shannon has to do is think about, well, we have to like actually figure out a way to do this so that we're not transmitting a ton of data so that it can avoid detection. You have to figure out little tips and tricks and tools to like take a certain word and turn it into something entirely different. Alan Turing was doing this work, you know, obviously with like ciphers and other things in the UK. Turing and Shannon, funny enough, became friends. There's a part of this that is about encoding, and a part of it that interestingly like runs through a legacy of code breaking and code making, right? Which I always found like one of the more interesting parts of this, like the idea of like secret codes, things that we were trying to hide, ultimately lead to a world in which we don't have to hide anything. You can communicate anything about yourself, right? It's a kind of cool thing. It's a very interesting historical irony that it is like information we were trying to conceal from people is what gives us the ability to conceal nothing from people.
You know, for a little context of a comment you made earlier in the conversation where you said that his children said that they had to roll a dice and create entropy to do the dishes. Now that they've got a little taste on like what he did for the world with some of these theories, it makes more sense, I guess, to hear that that's the kind of thing he did with his kids.
It's actually like, by the way, the other piece of it, I'll tell you, is like a bunch of my favorite Shannon stories, ironically, are not scientific stories; they're parenting stories. I'll give you one more example, and I think this made it into the book, but I don't know if it did. There was an oversized tree on his property at one point. It was like a big tree. They had a bit of land, and the natural thing to do was like it was like an aging tree, and you got to take it down because it's unsafe or whatever, or there was an eyesore. I don't even remember why they were going to cut it, but they needed to cut it. And Shannon had this thought. He said, you know, instead of cutting it down, what we should do is we should hire some people to basically file the tree down so that it's sort of like a flagpole that's growing in the ground. And then we should carve a skull at the very top of the tree and hoist a pirate flag up this carved tree with the skull on top. And that's exactly what they did. So they built this thing, they fashioned and piled this tree down, like got a skull on the top, hoisted a Jolly Roger up the flagpole, and the whole reason they did it, there's no purpose. They just did it because Shannon thought it was funny and kind of interesting, right? I'll give you another example. One morning, I guess Andrew, his son, woke up, said he's got a performance at school, and I guess he was going to do a solo performance, and there was some kind of competition or something, and he was going to play the trumpet. Shannon said, well, would it be interesting if your trumpet breathes fire? And his son was like, yeah, it would. So Shannon constructed a flame-throwing trumpet that Andrew used at school to perform. Again, with no practical purpose, just because he thought it'd be funny and kind of clever and interesting. And this is, you know, we talked a lot about information theory and about the details and the arcana of the science. It's worth appreciating that a lot of the fun of doing this project was just figuring out kind of the zaniness of Claude Shannon. He was just like somebody who like had an idea and did it, you know? Like it was actually one of the more, there's a parts of it that's more endearing, because we take especially adults, we take ourselves super seriously, right? Like, it's like, we all take ourselves a little too seriously. Shannon never did. And it was one of those things that I still remain inspired by it.
A mind at play, right?
Like,
I mean, you nailed the title. And when you're saying all these stories that are just, they sound so loony, right? I go back to a statement that you said where you were describing the word, the sentence there that you kind of flipped. But you were like, it's the same amount of data, but it's the surprise in it that communicates or is, what was the word you used?
The information is contained in the surprise. Meaning if I can predict it, it's actually not informative by Shannon's definition of information. It's not informative. Information is contained in the surprise. That's one, it's like a little bit of a very simplified way to think about information.
I'm just thinking of the flagpole.
There you go.
I mean, it's such a surprise.
Yeah.
All right. Unfortunately, I'm so sorry. I take great pride in reading any book of a person I bring on the show. I have not read The Founders yet. I need to read this. What?
Well, I will gladly send a copy along.
I would love to read this. Especially because our show covers all these various billionaires and what they did, and to give people just a quick rundown on what the book was and what you were trying to accomplish and maybe your motivation on it.
For sure. And I'm happy to come back on and chat about it because it's very much longer conversation.
Yeah.
I suspect in some ways, like your audience is more familiar with the people who are at the heart of that book than they are with Claude Shannon. You know, maybe. PayPal is a company that has existed at this point for over 20 years. If you're listening, you probably use one of their products because they own Venmo now. You know, obviously the core PayPal ecosystem, everything else. And it also has given it's given rise to a group known as the PayPal Mafia. That includes people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Reid Hoffman, David Sachs, the founders of Yelp, YouTube, LinkedIn, Yammer, Palantir. I mean, every significant company to come out of Silicon Valley, arguably for 20 years, has some tie back to this ecosystem, right? Whether they're like an investor or something, or you know, whatever. And many years ago, I think at this point, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe actually longer, I got this idea in my head. I was like, you know, everyone's talking about these people, but how come no one's ever gone back and asked them like how they all ended up at the same company at the same time? That seems kind of weird, right? Like I was like, the question was just like, wait, hold on. Elon and Peter and all these people worked at the same company. Like, what was in the water? I mean, it was literally the question I was asking. It's one of my sentences in the introduction to the book. What was in the water there, right? Because if you think about it, like if it was a graduate school, literally every person on the planet would want to get in, right? And I got the sense that there was a story there that hadn't been told, because what happened is that these people became so larger than life that the focus of everyone's attention is kind of like, what are you doing today? Not what did you do 20 years ago? So through hook and crook and a lot of intros and everything else, I interviewed around 300 people, and I wrote the book. It's called The Founders, and it's about the story of PayPal from 1998 to 2002. So it is the story of creating this payments architecture and this startup during the dot-com bubble bursting and during, you know, all these other events happened. But basically, it's this crazy 4-year sprint to build this company. And it has everything in it from like what you'd expect, like kind of like, how did Elon get the idea to do this company? Why was it called X.com at one point? All of those things. In addition to, like, there are a lot of things that were invented at PayPal that you probably use without knowing it. I'll give you one example. CAPTCHA tests. These tests where you have to identify that you are a human and not a robot. Those were commercialized at PayPal. And the reason they were commercialized at PayPal is because when PayPal designed its system, a bunch of people started creating bots to create fake PayPal accounts so they could get the sign-on bonuses. The company needed to devise a way to separate Preston, flesh and blood human user from like 10 robots Preston created to collect $10 bonuses, right? They did that with the first application of the CAPTCHA tool. It was
Surprise.
the first time.
They did it with surprise.
It was surprise. And at first, the people who were on the product team were like horrified because they thought this would like nuke new signups. And it turned into an innovation that is literally all over the internet. I mean, you can't use most websites these days without having some kind of the financial services website, certainly without having some kind of gate like that. I could go on and on. That group created things in financial services that still affect our lives today. And then I thought it was just interesting to know, like, before they flew private and ran the world, who were these people? Like, who were these people when they were in their early 20s? How did they figure life out? How did they get to Silicon Valley? What's
a common thread you found in that question?
Which one?
What they did early in their life.
And, you know, there's a lot of people at the heart of the story. So there's like a few common threads, right? But I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because it's like a little tough. I would say that like a lot of them were, you know, building things on computers when it wasn't cool to do so, you know, and when it wasn't lucrative to do so. So remember, like, the internet economy doesn't really become an economy until the mid to late 90s when Netscape goes public, right? Before then, the internet is like this thing that academics use, and it's a thing that like nerds use, right? It's not a way to become a billionaire. Like nobody is like pointing, like you, in the 80s in particular, if you wanted to become very, very wealthy, you went into financial services. You didn't go into technology, right? Or and if you went into technology, you did hardware, not software. You didn't do the internet. So all these people like kind of tinkering, they're playing with computers, they're doing things, they all move out west, the boom starts. And so and like a lot of them study computer science, engineering, not all of them. There are a bunch of people on the business side who are more traditional humanities tracks. But I would say that like one common theme is like, I noticed that many of them had built businesses before they ever joined PayPal. So for Max Levchin, who's one of the co-founders, one of the best known co-founders, he is now the CEO and founder of a firm. PayPal was his 5th business, and he had 4 failures in college, right? While he was like moonlighting as a student, he was also building businesses. It's his 5th or 6th company, right? Elon had a computer company he built in college. Then he had Zip2. I think he had an arcade when he was living in South Africa. And then he had PayPal. So it was like his 4th, maybe his 5th, right? And so you just have people who are like serial entrepreneurs, but minus the word entrepreneur, because that makes it sound fancier than it is. They were just building businesses and trying to figure it out along the way. And so I would say that's a common thread. I would say the other common thread is like, there's a lot of game playing, puzzle playing, chess playing. There's a lot of like that in the air at PayPal. There's a bunch of stories in the book about that, but obviously Peter Thiel was a well-known chess player. But I would say like a lot of chess titans within this group, a lot of poker players. There's a lot of that kind of puzzle solving, game playing in the ether as well. But it's a fascinating story because it's like, who are these people before they become relentless objects of attention today? Right. I find the most interesting thing to me about writing biographies is figuring out who people are before they become like rich, famous, or successful.
Yes.
Because to me, like, that's like, I want to know who they are when they're closer to me. Like I'm like trying to solve these Rubik's Cubes for myself. And so that's like, I don't actually find most of the contemporary coverage on these people all that interesting because the truth is when you're at that level, it's not, your life becomes a little bit more like boxed in. But when you're in your 20s and nobody knows who you are, the world is a blank page.
You got to go upstream, right?
Yeah.
What is one of the stories? I mean, you've interviewed some just incredible people, 300 people for the second book. Oh my God. What is a really unique, surprising, let me use that word. What is a surprising story from one of these billionaires or very unique people that you had the opportunity to interview that you just off the top of your head, it could be any one of them?
Oh, I mean, there's so many, but let me pick a couple. One that people may know, but they should really think a little bit more about, which is, there is this temptation these days that like, I think if Elon ate a piece of fruit, there would be a bunch of hate about that piece of fruit, right? Like I feel like if he suddenly got into like raspberries, it'd be like an anti-raspberry coalition, or some nonsense like that. And I think that one of the nice things about writing about a very specific and defined period of his life is that I wasn't asking him any questions about SpaceX, Tesla, Twitter, none of that. I was studying the years 1998 to 2002. And one way to think about the years 1998 to 2002 in his life is that it's during this period that he gets kicked out. He gets overthrown at PayPal as the CEO. He almost dies because he contracts malaria and meningitis while on a trip abroad. And he loses a child. And people don't really know because he doesn't talk about it all the time. But I went pretty deep on the history of that little moment, and I wrote about it at the end. And you think about what someone's been through, and it looks like these days his life is a glide path. He can say whatever he wants, et cetera. But like there's this real profound 4-year period of difficulty in which, like he struggles with the hardest thing that anyone I think could struggle with. As a parent myself, I can't fathom losing my kid, and he has an infant die, sudden infant SIDS, whatever the acronym is, And it's this really interesting thing. And I think at the end of chapter 14 is when he leaves the story because, he gets thrown out as CEO. But I think people would really benefit from reading that, especially people who kind of throw stones and don't realize there was a period in which Like there wasn't like it wasn't a glide path. There wasn't a $56 billion payday. There wasn't all the that's I think you need to have a little bit of I think humility about the people in our business life who become like business celebrities, and to appreciate that there's a humanity there. There's some challenge there. There's some struggle there. So that's one story. It's a little surprising. The other thing I would say is the fact that this company, PayPal, it's created like as the dot-com bubble is just getting to its peak, and months after its creation, March of 2000, the bubble bursts, and all of a sudden, like the NASDAQ loses 86% of its value that year, like 86% of its value. People like Barron's is writing, like they had this famous cover story. It's like DOT.bomb, right? And it was about, Amazon.bomb. It was like Amazon.bomb. And the idea was like Amazon's share price at the time was $9. And everyone's like, oh, this is it. The internet's like a total hype machine. It's all nonsense, right? It's all foolishness. September 11th happens during the early creation years of PayPal, 9/11. And it massively changes things like KYC rules, know your customer rules, and financial regulation, because the government suddenly wants to crack down on terrorist financing. There are all of these things that happen in this company. They get sued, they get hacked, they get not hacked, they get like people trying to defraud them. They're in this epic battle with eBay. They are in one of the worst markets for IPOs after 9/11. There wasn't an IPO for like 3 or 4 months because 9/11 is like the financial services industry is in rubble, literal rubble, right? Mm-hmm. You have two competitors, X.com, which is Elon's company, and Confinity, which is Peter Thiel and Max Levchin's company. They fight for 3 months, then have a merger that's basically organized within 4 or 5 weeks, right? And this is all just before the bubble burst. There's no financing left in venture for this kind of company. So I would just say that the surprising thing about PayPal is the mere fact that it survived. Most surprising thing about PayPal is this company should have gone under. None of this should have happened, and it stayed alive. And that's the cool part of the story, is how do you keep a company alive when you're under siege, right? And the pressure's on and everything is like chaos, right? And there's not low interest rates, and there's not easy money, and there's not $100 million rounds that are being thrown at people. To my mind, that's actually like one of the cool things about this. And it's one of the things that this team walked away with is they built something successful, but it came during a period of real hardship. And it meant that every subsequent thing they did, YouTube, Yelp, Palantir, SpaceX, Tesla, LinkedIn, that they were accustomed to this difficulty. And that's probably a good way to preview that particular project for those who are interested.
I like that point a lot. Well, an interesting tidbit, and you might have to correct me here on this, but when Elon left as the CEO and Peter Thiel, I believe, was the one that came in and replaced him, there was obviously bad blood there when that took place. But what's interesting is decades later, Elon is really struggling with SpaceX. It's about to go bust. And Peter Thiel was the guy that showed up. I can't remember the number, but I believe it was over $1 billion. And gave him a lifeline that was somewhat of a repayment or karma or whatever you want to call it later.
I'll just because I did this homework. It's funny you referenced something that is one of the final lines I have at the end of chapter 14 of the book.
Yeah,
and it was actually when SpaceX, not at $1 billion, it was like I think it was 14 million or 20 million or something.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And it comes from Founders Fund. And it is one of the parts of the story that people miss, which is they did have a feud. They did have a moment where Peter replaced Elon as CEO. There was a lot of bitterness on both sides, right? And so like, if you were to talk to Peter or Max, they thought they were doing the right thing. If you talk to Elon, he thought they were doing the wrong thing. But it is the case that Peter invests in Elon, and more than that, like invests in Elon, and will often, he had said to me something like, there's a reason I don't invest in other companies and industries that Elon is in, because I know what it's like to compete against Elon, and you're going to lose, right?
He's relentless.
And so it's interesting because it isn't just that there is like respect. There's a difference between respecting somebody and giving them a $15 million check for their rocket company, right? And so you're right on the broad outline, which is like There may have been some temporary misgivings about how things happened, but over time, there's a partnership there that has actually, has withstood a lot.
People underestimate Elon's proof of work from his early days. Like the Zip2, I remember reading that like he slept underneath of his desk. And so when he buys Twitter and he goes in there and he's conducting the audit, and then he fires 80% of everybody in the company, and everybody's like, the place is going to fall apart. There's no way you can do that. It's because Elon went in there and was like, all right, let me see all the code contributes of every programmer in this company. And he's going through and he's auditing all of them. He's like, okay, yeah, we can downsize this by 80% and we're not going to have any issues because I've written the code for this GPS, navigation system 3 decades ago or whatever it was from that moment in time. So yeah, there's people that underestimate like what that guy has done in his life and how gritty he has gotten his own hands in writing code or whatever it might be from an engineering standpoint. But
I think that's right. I would say the other piece of it is like, and it's hard, right? Because he's one of the most covered subjects in the world right now. And by the way, like my book is not, it's not a book where I'm like trying to praise him or trying to criticize him. I just went where the facts took me. So I interviewed a lot of people. I had a bunch of email. I had about 6 gigabytes of email from that era that someone shared with me. So I had a day by. So for people who were listening, like maybe the reason to read the book is because you can read Elon's resignation note. You don't even have to take my word for it, right? Like it's all there. It's all just facts, right? But I would say that one of the things that happens is that people underestimate his willingness to do whatever it takes to have his companies be successful. And the way that kind of focus inspires engineers to do their best work too. A lot of the people writing about Elon are not engineers. And so the problem is like they're writing about things, but they don't have any kind of understanding of how those things work. And so it's easy to look at something like, I'm going to lay off 80% of Twitter and say, that's terrible. It's another thing for somebody who has been the CEO of, at that point, 2 internet companies, Zip2 and PayPal, to look at a situation and say, well, here are the things that matter in this business. Here are the things that don't matter. And I need to cut costs because that's like part of the issue here is that it's just things are deeply inefficient. I don't know enough about that situation to know what was right and what was wrong and what was executed well and what was executed poorly. But I think that one caution I would give to listeners who are reading things about Elon is to remember that most of the people writing about him don't have an engineering background. And it's actually a real deficit when you're writing about things like rocket engineering or car design or anything like that.
Love it. Jimmy, I'm so thrilled with this conversation, and just your book is phenomenal for people that want to pick this up. A Mind at Play, and the other book is called The Founders. And is there anything else that you want to highlight or point people towards, a website, or I know you're active on Twitter or X.
I'm not that active on X. I mean, I'm as active as I need to, but I love hearing from readers. And you can just find me. I have a website, jimmysoni.com, but just find me on X and DM. I love hearing from folks who are in this space. And I would just say, I really appreciate your enthusiasm for Shannon. Like, it's kind of awesome. And it's actually one thing that unites the two worlds is like the people I interviewed, knew who Claude Shannon was, like Elon references Claude Shannon on X from time to time because these ideas still last decades later. And there is something really inspiring about that. I mean, like ultimately all of us want to do work that stands the test of time. And so it's interesting to me that Shannon has had kind of a second life. The only other thing I would say is, I am quite curious if Anthropic's Claude is named after Claude Shannon, and nobody's been able to pin that one down for me yet. And so I'd be really like, if any of your listeners or you or somebody can like put a signal into the universe and figure that one out, I would be really grateful because that'd be cool.
Let us know, folks. We might get, I don't know, we get like 100,000 listeners on it.
There you go. Maybe somebody working at Anthropic knows, and they're like, no, it's actually Jean-Claude Van Damme. They just thought that was really cool.
Awesome. Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for your time. This was a real pleasure, and hopefully we'll get another chance to chat sometime in the future.
That sounds great. Thank you, Preston.
All right. See ya.
The chapter sounded insane. It was this very short chapter just alleging this conspiracy that manipulated our food supply. So I began fact checking it like a reporter does. And to my shock, he had understated the case. And when I began pulling this sheet back a little bit, what it revealed was what I would argue to be the most consequential conspiracy of the past 60 years in terms of its effect on the health of our nation.